Today, let us talk about moral objectivism, which is the third chapter of the book written by Louis Pojman. Perhaps the best way to start this chapter is to talk about and think through the story of Seba, the girl from Mali. And so the story goes. I was raised by my grandmother in Mali, and when I was still a little girl, a woman my family knew came and asked her if she could take me to Paris to care for her children. She told my grandmother that she would put me in school and that I would learn French. But when I came to Paris, I was not sent to school. I had to work every day. In her house, I did all the work. I cleaned the house, cooked the meals, cared for the children, and washed and fed the baby. Every day, I started work before 7 a.m. and finished about 11 p.m. I never had a day off. My mistress did nothing. She slept late and then watched television or went out. One day, I told her that I wanted to go to school. She replied that she had not brought me to France to go to school but to take care of her children. I was so tired and run down. I had problems with my teeth. Sometimes my cheek would swell and the pain would be terrible. Sometimes I had stomach aches, but when I was ill, I still had to work. Sometimes when I was in pain, I would cry, but my mistress would shout at me. She would often beat me. She would slap me all the time. She beat me with a broom, with kitchen tools, or whipped me with the electric cable. Sometimes I would bleed. I still have marks on my body. Once in 1992, I was late going to get the children from school. My mistress and her husband were furious with me and beat me and then threw me out on the street. I didn't understand anything and I wandered on the street. After some time, her husband found me and took me back to the house. There they stripped me naked, tied my hands behind my back, and began to whip me with a wire attached to a broomstick. Both of them were beating me at the same time. I was bleeding a lot and screaming, but they continued to beat me. Then she rubbed chili pepper into my wounds and stuck it in my vagina, and I lost consciousness. From the story of Seba, Pojman would say that there are three moral principles that are being violated by those who are supposed to foster Seba. And these principles are: first is respect for freedom. Second is that we must not cause unnecessary suffering on any living being. And third is that we must treat people as ends in themselves and never just as means. But in the philosophical landscape, these demands, rather these moral principles that are being violated in the case of Seba, represent, or better yet, manifest Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy, which is grounded on the capacity or on the belief of the capacity of the human being for rational determination. Now, for Kant, every human being must be respected in such a way that his dignity as a person must always be the forefront of our dealing with each other. Right, so what is the point now? What is the thesis of moral objectivism in a sense? Well, for Pojman, moral objectivism says that there are therefore objective moral principles that are valid for all people and all social environments. For Pojman, however, there is a need to distinguish the differences between moderate moral objectivism with moral absolutism. And the most popular the classic proponent for the latter, which is moral absolutism, is Saint Thomas Aquinas was theorizing from like many years ago. Saint Thomas Aquinas' absolutism is also known as ontological realism, a popular notion, not really very popular though, that says things exist independent of the mind. But if there's one thing that stands out in Aquinas' entire philosophy, it is the idea of the natural law theory. Now, the natural law theory says that eternal moral law that can be discovered through reason by looking at the nature of humanity and society exists, and that the whole universe is governed by laws that exhibit rationality. And the other one says that natural laws can actually be seen to be operative in the laws of the nations. And these are the claims that Aquinas made in his popular theory called natural law. How do we make sense of this? Really depends on how we look at the theory at its face value. Because really the point is that the theory of the natural law, right, is about the teleological laws of nature, or the teleological nature of the laws itself. So for Aquinas, as well as for Aristotle in the slide here, both gentlemen really believed or were convinced, despite the chronological distance that separated them, that there are purposes or ends to anything that happens or to anything that we do. So that when, for example, we consider nature, and if by nature we mean the objective physical world to have existed, for Aquinas and for Aristotle, their existence must be for a particular end. Or that if we do something, we do this thing or that act with a particular purpose. Kind of reminds us of the idea from the Bible, especially from the Ecclesiastes, that everything happens for a particular reason. So there is reason that governs the emergence of things in life, both in the unseen and seen worlds. So purpose, ends, reasons, these are key terms to both Aristotle and Aquinas, and that is what defined their philosophy. Alright, so very briefly, there are key ideas to the natural law tradition. First idea says that human beings are of rational nature established by God, who is the designer or the prime mover. And that secondly, reason enables us to see through the necessary laws for human flourishing, and that these natural laws are universal and unchangeable, and that even these become the basis to evaluating social laws. Right. But we cannot also deny that there are certain circumstances when we find it difficult to decide which course of action must be taken. If either consequences of a certain action, we may call X, yield to a more favorable moral discernment, where both consequences of our action or the options that spring forth or consequences that spring forth from our decision may not either really go in our favor. And so for this matter, Aquinas provided a tool which is called the doctrine of double effect. The doctrine of double effect determines the acceptability of an act based on, first, the nature of the act itself or the action, And for Aquinas, for the action to be acceptable, it must be at least basically morally good or indifferent. The second refers to the means ends condition. It says that a bad act must not be the means for the pursuit of whatever it is that you want to do or you have decided in life. The third condition is called right intention. Refers to the idea that an action must achieve only the good effect without intending to commit bad means. And the last condition is, of course, the proportionality condition, which says that the good effect must be equal to the bad effect, if not outweighs it. Now, these conditions set in the doctrine of double effect are what determines time and again the correctness of the act. If one is in doubt, and if one is not so sure, or if one is not so sure about how to act and what to act when, she only needs to consult these conditions. For Aquinas, these are absolute conditions that determine the acceptability of an act, regardless of the consequences that the act may eventually generate. However, there are critiques to the doctrine of double effect, and Pojman even mentions in the book that, among others, it's the challenge given by Philippa Foot that stands out against this Aquinian principle. But even prior to the discussion of Philippa Foot's theory of the trolley problem, Pojman laid down several contentions against the doctrine of double effect. All right. Okay. So for Pojman, there are inherent problems with the doctrine of double effect. According to him, the first is the counterintuitive nature or patterns of thought in the doctrine itself. Second is that the doctrine of double effect is not always clear as to how closely and effective must be the principle connected with the act to be counted as the intended act. And we can find that perhaps later in the trolley problem set by Philippa Foot. The third problem is that according to Pojman, the doctrine of double effect is not clear as to how to describe the act or acts themselves. And what makes it worse is that the doctrine of double effect seems to not take into account that human actions, all of them, according to Pojman, are deeply telos oriented, which means that human actions always have purpose, and purposes do come in conflict. Now, to answer this, let's walk through the trolley problem as proposed by Philippa Foot in order to better understand these problems. So you can see on the picture, a rather simple picture, but one that is loaded with complex moral viewpoints, actually. The problem here is about how to quantify the effects or which effect to choose or consequence to choose when we are acting morally or deciding or behaving within the capacity of a moral agent. For Pojman, even if one clearly thinks that he is doing something good, of course, perhaps always situate ourselves in that role a problem, still the effect of one's decision or choice leads to a rather terrible, horrible rather, consequence or consequences. As to which life to save, that is no longer part of the consideration. But it seems that the doctrine of double effect cannot best decide on this context. It seems that utilitarianism, or the theory which says an act is good if it brings about more happiness and pain, is at work more than the doctrine of double effect in this situation. Now, while we are not saying that the doctrine of double effect is at all times problematic, we are only saying, according to Pojman, that at some point the doctrine itself is not applicable if not necessary. Right. So the best thing to do is to set the theory aside, according to Pojman, and think that absolute moral principles may actually have some limitations. And because of that limitations, they cease to be absolute. So Pojman is more keen to suggesting that perhaps it is more plausible to think that only moderate moral objective principles exist, and that maybe or perhaps it's about time to put into the sideways our insistence for an absolute morality. And because of this, Pojman came up with what he thought to be a set of objective and moderate moral principles which may work, if not universally, at least with the majority of the world or global population or human population. The first of this is the demand, the maxim that it can never be acceptable to kill innocent people, or that under no circumstance or circumstances must we be allowed to cause unnecessary pain or suffering on any sentient lives, or that we cannot accept lying or deception, or that we must not accept that stealing or cheating become a maxim for everyone, especially for children, or that we are obliged to keep our promises and honor contracts, and that we should not deprive another person of his or her freedom. Also, another norm that Pojman thought to be acceptable as moderate, objective norm is the call to do justice and treat people as they deserve to be treated, at least not as simply means to your ends in the Kantian way, and that we must also reciprocate, that is, we show gratitude for service rendered, and that it's also morally good or acceptable to help other people, especially when the cost to oneself is only very minimal, and above all, we obey just laws. So these are the examples of moderate and objective laws which we no longer have to discuss further due to the simplicity of how they are being formulated. Yes, and perhaps the area where Pojman really saw great optimism for arguing for the possibility of a moderate moral objectivism resides in what he believes to be our common human nature, and that this common human nature is also the basis for our common morality. And so he says, quoting Aristotle, that one may also observe in one's travels to distant countries the feelings of recognition and affiliation that link every human being to every other human being, and that there is more that unites all humanity than divides us. Very interestingly, toward the end of the chapter, Pojman left for us the so-called premise on common morality by arguing that human nature is relatively similar in essential respects, having a common set of basic needs and interests, and moral principles are functions of human needs and interests, instituted by reason to meet the needs and promote the most significant interests of human beings. Also, that some moral principles will meet needs and promote human interests better than other principles, and principles that will meet essential human needs and promote the most significant interests in optimal ways are objectively valid moral principles. Therefore, because there is a common human nature, there is an objectively valid set of moral principles applicable to all humanity or human beings. And to finally conclude this discussion on moral objectivism, we may now turn to the message that says that moral principles do exist and they are there to give the maximal guarantee for the good life. As Pojman put it, we are to judge based on the best reasoning that we can simply supply in dialogue with other cultures and with the sympathy and understanding. Virtually all moral theories recognize that morality serves human good, although they weigh that idea differently. And I hope you guys learned something from this short lecture. Till next time.